All right. A very good morning and welcome to all of you. Now, we had discussed 3 questions in the class yesterday. The rest I had sent over to you. लिखे हैं सारे? All right. Now, question number 4. Political and military factors were at the heart of the success of British imperialism in India. Discuss critically. So, what does the question require you to do? This is not the heart of the success. ठीक है. और फिर उसके बाद alternative reasons देने पड़ेंगे why the British prevailed over the Indian powers. ठीक है. तो demand तो sorted है. Now the political and military factors. What were these? क्या है ये? बताइए, what were the political and military factors responsible for the success of British imperialism? You can, yes, you can, yeah, you can. Yes, you can do that. बिल्कुल कर सकते हैं. Okay. Okay. Got an exclusive charter. What else? Government of India Act 1858 completed the process of imperialism. But by that point of time, the final shape of the British Empire in India had already emerged, right? So we are talking about the process of empire building. Why the British were able to defeat one Indian power after the other with such ease? Why no Indian power could present any challenge to the British? Hamadesh. Efficient leadership. What else? अच्छा, और ओके. अच्छा, और अच्छा, एनीथिंग एल्स? कंटिन्यूअस फाइनेंशियल सपोर्ट. और कुछ? फीलिंग ऑफ सुपीरियर रेस. अच्छा, तो देखो, while we are talking about the political and military factors, a few things need to be kept in mind. That it was not only the political and military superiority of the British, but also the political and military inferiority of the Indian ruling class. ठीक है? तो दोनों को एक साथ कॉन्ट्रास्ट करके चलोगे तभी काम बनेगा, अदरवाइज अधूरा रह जाएगा आंसर. Now, while Britain had already undergone the process of modernization of the political system, and had attained the shape of a modern nation state. In India, no such process had taken place. India was politically fragmented at this point of time. The concept of an Indian citizen did not exist at this point of time. People in India were no more than the subjects of their rulers. What is the basic difference between the two? सिटीजन और सब्जेक्ट में बेसिक डिफरेंस क्या होता है? Citizens have a body of well-defined rights, while subjects do not. Becoming a citizen makes the person a willing participant in the national life, whereas subjects are simply mute spectators to the various political and economic developments which are being brought about because of royal initiative. ठीक है? तो कौन से क्लास ऑफ पीपल आर दे गोइंग टू बी मोर इन्वेस्टेड इन द सक्सेस ऑफ देयर पॉलिटिकल क्लास? द सिटीजन्स रादर देन द सब्जेक्ट्स. ब्रिटेन में ये ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन आ चुका था. वहां पे डेमोक्रेटिक इंस्टीट्यूशंस वर वेल इन द प्रोसेस ऑफ इमर्जिंग. इंडिया में ऐसा कोई डेवलपमेंट नहीं हो रहा था. सो दैट वाज वन फैक्टर. What else? This was once again a result of the modernization of British political system or European politics. क्या? That Britain as a nation was already engaged in international competition and conflict against other nation states, whereas in India क्या प्रोसेस हो रहा था? The ruling class was engaged in a regional conflict with the ruling class of their neighbors. ठीक है? So which of these was better prepared to succeed in the international arena? The British, obviously. Third, with the democratization of politics, merit had become the basis for public appointments. So the best talent was getting an opportunity to rise to the very top. Whereas in India, under monarchical government, merit was not allowed to shine. ठीक है? Therefore, the British enjoyed the services of a superior class of officials and administrators, organizers and generals. The Indians did not. Then, coming to the military factors, the British enjoyed technological advances over their Indian counterpart. They had better training. As a result of the long military tradition that they had to develop as a result of compulsion. Why? Because they were constantly at war with their European neighbors across the English Channel. Okay? Because of the same reason that the British are an island race, therefore, their main strength was a very well-developed navy. And in contrast, Indian naval strength was relatively underdeveloped at this point of time. Okay? Further, in India, the British were able to employ a large number of Indian soldiers, give them European training at a cheaper cost. Therefore, while both the Indians as well as the British had access to the same body of Indian soldiers, the difference in quality, training, discipline, and morale was extremely wide. So the Indian sepoy was a much more effective soldier than the Hindustani Sipahi. Okay? So these are the political and military factors. However, this is not the complete picture. Apart from this, a number of economic and cultural factors were also responsible. Right. The first difference was the way in which the Indians perceived the British versus how the British perceived the Indians. In the British perception, what was India? It was a single, unified whole culturally. Okay? Therefore, even their diplomatic relations with the independent Indian regional kingdoms were put in place with the perspective of establishing dominance over the entire subcontinent, not simply to regulate the bilateral relations between the company and that particular state. Whereas Indians perceived the British as simply another European trading company. And this was a big miscalculation on their part. Why? Because the English East India Company was not any ordinary company. It was, first of all, a joint stock company, and thus was able to mobilize the collective wealth of Britain. Secondly, the English East India Company also enjoyed a special relationship with the British Crown. Not only was it the external affairs wing of the British government, it was also the wing to regulate Britain's external trade. In fact, by the 17th century, it had also emerged as the overseas conquering arm of the British Empire. Okay? So it had emerged as the instrument of British foreign policy as well as external trade and imperialism. Furthermore, the East India Company was an empire in its own right. Okay? It had vast overseas territories, enormous resources at its disposal, as well as a huge military. Right? Therefore, in the competition between the Indian regional kingdoms and the British, the Indian regional kingdoms were not simply competing against another European company, rather, they were competing against a global empire which could mobilize vast resources from different corners of the globe. Okay? And thus, this contest from the beginning was highly unevenly matched. Clear है इतना? Secondly, the British also received the benefit of having undergone major intellectual movements such as the Renaissance, Reformation, and the Enlightenment. And the collective results, collective effects of these movements were that the British obtained a huge lead in the fields of trade, technology, political modernization, economic organization, and intellectual development. ठीक है? And this created a wide gulf between the British and the Indians. While the Indians were still living in the medieval age, the British had firmly stepped into the modern age. So a modern civilization was at now odds with a medieval civilization. So once again, a highly unevenly matched contest. केवल एक ही आउटकम हो सकता था, that is a British victory. ठीक है? Now, although you could have cited some other factors, but these are the most important ones, most relevant ones. समझ में आया है? How are you going to begin and end this answer? इंट्रोडक्शन में क्या लिखना है? नहीं, यू ऑलरेडी हैव द मॉडल ऑफ द बॉडी ना, तो उसके हिसाब से रीफ्रेम करने की कोशिश करो इंट्रोडक्शन को. कौन सा? पॉलिटिकल मिलिट्री फैक्टर्स वाला. अच्छा, तो ये आपको इंट्रोडक्शन में लिखना चाहिए, कंक्लूजन में? ये कंक्लूजन में करना चाहिए, राइट? इंट्रोडक्शन में क्या करोगे? अच्छा, एनीबडी एल्स? और कोई? नहीं? हाँ. हम्म. अच्छा, ओके. तो देखो, जब भी कंफ्यूज हो ना कि प्रॉपर बिगनिंग क्या होना चाहिए, ऑलवेज रीड द क्वेश्चन वंस अगेन. Political and military factors were at the heart of the success of British imperialism in India. So you have to talk about the success of British imperialism in India, so that you can then go on to investigate the factors behind it, right? So here you have to write that over the 18th and early 19th century, the British transformed themselves from a company of ordinary traders into the undisputed masters of the Indian subcontinent. This remarkable achievement has traditionally been credited to British political and military superiority. Full stop. However, the issue needs a fresh appraisal, right? And then you can first discuss the political and military factors and then the economic and cultural factors. How about the conclusion? You will have to give your final opinion about the basic question. Kya? That yes, political and military factors played a very important role in ensuring the success of British imperialism, but these were not the only factors. Rather, upon closer observation, it becomes apparent that economic and cultural factors played a more significant role. Okay? So that is the note on which we are going to conclude. Clear hai? Okay. Next question, number 5. To what extent would it be correct to say that the British established their Indian empire in a fit of absent-mindedness? Right? Now, किस नोट से इस आंसर को शुरू करना चाहिए? उसके लिए थोड़ा पता होना चाहिए इस इशू के बारे में. Are you familiar with this concept that the British made their empire in India in a fit of absent-mindedness? This was a historical opinion expressed by which school of historians? Colonial historians, in order to relieve the British of the guilt of conquering Indians. To justify the creation of the British Empire, they came up with this idea that it was not a pre-planned process. Imperialism in India was accidental, and that the British officials present in India were not being directed by their superiors in Britain, and this had nothing to do with the British people or the British government. Rather, the officials in India were simply responding to the evolving situation on the ground level. In order to preserve their own economic interests, they conquered different portions of India one after the other. ठीक है? अब ये एक historical opinion है. Has this remained uncontested या फिर इसको challenge भी किया गया है? It has been challenged as well. Therefore, this is an issue of historical debate. And in the introduction, you should clarify that this issue is hotly debated. ठीक है? तो introduction में किसके बारे में बात करनी है? The idea that this is a matter of debate, and there are two dominant schools of thought. फिर उसके बाद you come to the main body, divided into two parts. First, the colonial historians. They have argued that the process of the British imperialism was not pre-planned, it was not guided by the British government, rather it was due to the personal initiative of company officials in India. And even these company officials in India were not guided with the objective of empire building. Rather, they were simply responding to the evolving situation at the ground level, the threats and opportunities that constantly presented themselves with the grander objective of financial success. Okay? So this is what the colonial historians have argued. इतना समझ में आया है? अच्छा. Now, for a long time, the Indian historians could not come up with an alternative explanation. But finally, the colonial point of view was challenged by the historians of the Marxist school. What they have done is that they have systematically studied the expansion of the British Empire and divided it into different phases. Two phases primarily. Okay? Number one, from 1757 up to 1784. And number two, from 1784 up to 1858. And during the first phase, what is the pattern that we observe? That the British got engaged in some wars, such as the Anglo-French War and the Anglo-Bengal War. Right? However, these wars were fought for which purpose? To safeguard the British financial interests in India. Against emerging threats. Right? In the case of the Anglo-French War, which was the threat that the British were responding to? The French. In the Anglo-Bengal War, Siraj-ud-Daulah, followed by Mir Qasim and Shah Alam II, Shuja-ud-Daulah of Awadh, etc. Right? So battles of Plassey, battles of Buxar, they were both fought to safeguard British financial interest in India against emerging threats. Now, the sense that you should derive from this is that during this phase, the British were not actively looking for a conflict. They were not fighting simply for conquering territory, rather to save their own mercantile interests in India. Clear? However, this starts to change from 1784 onwards. (1784) एक नया एक्ट आएगा, कौन सा? पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट. For the first time, the company's government in India came under the control of the British government with the establishment of the Board of Control. So dual government in Britain started for regulating the Indian affairs. And it emerged as the permanent link between the company's territories in India and the British government. Right? So even though the official policy of the British government at this point of time may have been that they do not want to expand their territorial empire in India, all the expansion that was happening under their watch. Okay? So can the British government be completely absolved of the responsibility of conquering India? नहीं हो सकता है. ठीक है? Secondly, from 1813 onwards, the British even abandoned their official policy of non-intervention. They officially adopted the policy of imperialism. Right? And how was the relationship between the crown and company developing throughout this period between 1784 and 1858? Through the various regulating acts, the charter acts, the company was being brought under greater and greater political control of the British government. तो ये policy of imperialism actually किसका policy है? Is it the policy of the officials of the company in India, or is this the policy of the British government? It is the policy of the British government, right? And since imperialism had been adopted as the official policy of the British government from 1813 to 1858, can it be said to have taken place, the British imperialism, can it said to have taken place in a fit of absent-mindedness? No. There was a major component of planning that was involved. The British, in fact, designed their policies towards the Indian princely states with the objective of finally bringing them under either their indirect or direct control. Policies such as subsidiary alliance or doctrine of lapse or expansion of the military, or cultural conquest of India through westernization, and Christianization. ठीक है? तो अब बताओ whether this statement is valid that the British Empire in India was established in a fit of absent-mindedness. Not entirely valid. It may have been valid in the early stages of British imperialism, but it was not valid definitely during the final stages of imperialism, empire building in India. And on this note, you are going to conclude. समझ में आया है? Next question. The colonization of India shaped historical development over the next 2 centuries. Discuss this statement in the context of Indian and world history. हाँ. नहीं, this idea emerged along with the emergence of the industrial phase of capitalism. तो 1813 से लेकर 1858 तक this idea of civilizing India was the main cultural mission of the British. ठीक है? And all of their other policies, be it administrative, economic, political, social, they were all in response to this civilizing mission idea. उस समय dominant philosophies which were guiding the British policies in India, they were utilitarianism and liberalism. And both were the outcomes of the new industrial age. आगे जाकर के हमको डिस्कस करना है. There's a particular question, तो थोड़ा डिटेल में देखेंगे उसको. क्या क्या क्या? No. So in the initial phase, when the British till 1813, officially they were following a policy of non-intervention. Why? Because they wanted to reduce their government expenditure, military expenditure. So it was less useful to establish direct control, because then administrative expenditure, revenue expenditure, judicial expenditure, law and order expenditure, all of that would have to be increased. The British till 1813 were still in their mercantile phase. Therefore, they wanted to reduce their expenditure, increase their profits. And thus, they preferred to establish indirect control over the defeated rulers. Therefore, the English East India Company introduced the concept of paramountcy. उसने क्या बोला? That the British are the paramount power in the subcontinent, and all the other powers which exist with the express relief and at the pleasure of the British government. So a number of Indian rulers were reinstalled on their gaddis when they signed a British charter. तो एक legal document sign करवाया गया उनसे, company का charter. And one of the conditions of that charter was that the company reserved the right to repossess this entire kingdom, its territory, its resources and titles, dispossess the ruler if certain conditions are not fulfilled. Now, one of those conditions became the doctrine of lapse. So this was the basis, the legal basis for the British doctrine of lapse. Yeah. So till 1813, the British were not interested in establishing direct control over the Indian states, but they had come into conflict with a number of Indian rulers, right? A number of wars had been fought between 1857 to 1813. Instead of extending their direct control, they preferred to extend their indirect control. So उसके बेसिस वहां से लिंक है। अदर बिजनेसमैन वांटेड न्यू मार्केट, तो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी की मोनोपोली को खत्म करने की बात 1813 के बाद से शुरू होगी, उसके पहले से नहीं। ठीक है। एंड इंडिया में ब्रिटिश का पॉलिटिकल एक्सपेंशन भी उसी पीरियड से शुरू होगा, 1813 से लेकर के 1858 तक। ग्रेट रिवोल्ट के बाद सब कुछ खत्म हो जाएगा। नाउ नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, the colonization of India shaped the historical development over the next 2 centuries. Discuss this statement in the context of Indian and world history. Introduction. किस नोट से शुरू करना चाहिए आंसर को? टाइमलाइन से? अच्छा, और कुछ? आई थिंक this should be the most appropriate starting point. Colonization of India itself. उसमें आप टाइम की भी बात कर सकते हैं एंड अ ब्रीफ ग्लिम्स ऑफ द इम्पैक्ट उसकी बात कर सकते हैं, सो दैट यू कैन एलैबोरेट ऑन द इम्पैक्ट। किस तरह से इंडिया emerged as the crown jewel of the vast British Empire. Its conquest by the British rippled across the centuries and in many ways shaped the modern world. ठीक है, तो दिस कैन बी एन अप्रोप्रिएट बिगनिंग। आप कुछ ऑल्टरनेट भी यूज कर सकते हैं, बट व्हाट यू नीड टू बी अवेयर ऑफ इज व्हाट यू आर गोइंग टू राइट इन द मेन बॉडी ऑफ योर आंसर, एंड उसके हिसाब से अपना इंट्रोडक्शन लिखो। ठीक है। नाउ मेन बॉडी में कौन कौन सी डिमांड्स को एड्रेस करना है? इट्स इम्पैक्ट ऑन इंडिया फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, एंड सेकेंडली impact on the world. बताइए, impact on India. Okay. Political unification. The entire subcontinent was brought either under the direct or indirect rule of a single power for the first time after a very long period. ठीक है, and this created the geographical map of undivided India. और क्या? ठीक है, so India was linked to the global supply chain in a manner so deep that it had never experienced before. इसका नतीजा क्या निकला? First of all, India's deindustrialization, as British manufacturing overtook Indian handicrafts. Indian handicrafts were systematically destroyed because of uneven competition as well as uneven trade practices. ठीक है? दूसरा, commercialization of agriculture. Now, on the one hand, it theoretically increased the per capita income of the Indian farmer, but on the other hand, practically it made Indian farmers more vulnerable. Why? Because earlier they were subjected only to the local supply shocks. Now their fates are going to depend upon fluctuations in the supply and demand equation in the global economy. Okay? So theoretically and practically, there was a mismatch in the condition of Indian farmers. और इसका नतीजा क्या निकलेगा? Frequent famines, right? In fact, more than 40 major famines took place in different parts of India throughout the almost 190 years of colonial rule. ठीक है? And a number of minor famines, 40 major famines की बात कर रहे हैं. अच्छा. Apart from this, the British began to use India as a cash cow. Looting India's wealth through different channels, including drain of wealth, direct plunder, and home charges, and unrequited exports, etc. Right? This further compounded the economic problems that India was facing. It led to both underdevelopment as well as unbalanced regional growth or unbalanced development. ठीक है? Did the British make any attempt to engineer the Indian society? Yes. किस तरह का attempt? Westernization and Christianization. Now इनके पॉजिटिव एंड नेगेटिव इन्फ्लुएंसेस दोनों हुए, बट वी शुड फोकस मोर ऑन विच वन? पॉजिटिव्स. व्हाई? बिकॉज दे आर मोर कॉन्सिक्वेंशियल. किस तरह का पॉजिटिव इन्फ्लुएंस? दी modernization of the Indian society. It started with the British attempt to westernize India. How did they intend to westernize India? Through the spread of modern education. Which group received the benefits of modern British education? The urban middle class, the urban rich. So an urban middle class intelligentsia was born in the 19th century. And it was they who pioneered the process of modernization. They were the ones responsible for the socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century. They were the ones who infused the spirit of nationalism and pioneered the Indian national movement. They not only guided the spirit but also set the objectives of the national movement. So nationalism for India was forward looking because of their contributions. They were the ones who infused the spirit of liberalism, democracy, responsible government within Indian nationalism. तो modern age के जो political consciousness है, that came from this class, and this class was created by westernization efforts through education. ठीक है? And national movement का क्या रिस्पॉन्स, क्या इम्पैक्ट पड़ा? It viewed India as a modern nation state with well-defined borders, with absolute sovereignty over its territory and subjects, with a modern democratic system of government that is responsible to the people. This responsibility is to be expressed through representative legislative bodies. So the parliamentary system of government was introduced. The old prejudices surrounding color, race, caste, gender, all those were discarded. The idea of equality and social and economic justice became synonymous with the spirit of Indian nationalism as well as the modern Indian nation state. ठीक है? And the Indian national movement did not remain confined only to India. India also emerged as a guiding light to other colonized nations. So with the decolonization of India, the decolonization of the world began, and India emerged as a philosopher, friend, and guide to the newly independent countries. So it played a very important role in the process of decolonization as well. Okay? And with this, we have created a link between the impacts on India and impacts on the rest of the world. So, अब हमें किसके बारे में बात करनी है? Impact on the world. बताइए. As India came under British control, what did it do to Britain as a nation, to the British economy, and to British power? There was a major expansion. Yes, a rapid expansion in British power, prestige, and wealth. Right? Other European powers are going to feel threatened, and thus the French, the Italians, the Russians, the Turkish, what are all of them going to start doing? They are also going to start looking for their own colonial empire. Okay? So, global imperialism also saw an uptick with the British conquest of India. Over the next century after the conquest of Bengal, large portions of China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Australia were brought either under the direct or indirect control of one or the other European power. Okay? Now, another major boost for Britain was that with the conquest of Bengal, another process had started, and that was the Industrial Revolution in Britain. As Industrial Revolution accelerated, it became both the cause as well as effect of imperialism in India. Okay? And as the effect of imperialism in India, British industries received a major boost. Why? The vast, fertile, tropical soil of India was extremely useful for supplying a number of commercial crops. Okay? So India became a source of raw material. And the vast Indian populace emerged as consumers of British manufactured goods. So India also served as the largest market for British goods. ठीक है? And this gave British industries a significant lead over other industrializing nations. Right? Are they going to remain silent? No. And this resulted in an economic competition with the British. Right? Now, what were the ingredients for the success of British industrialization? A regular supply of raw material and a captive market. What did the other countries want? The same things. और वो कहाँ से मिलेगा? With colonies. Now, the British were also looking to expand their overseas colonies. They were not simply satisfied. And this economic competition is therefore going to lead to imperial wars. What is a century of industrialized warfare going to do to the mutual feeling that European countries had towards each other? Will there be any space for negotiation, for peaceful negotiation, for cooperation? वो सब खत्म हो जाएगा. In fact, that is going to be replaced by ultra-nationalism, militarism, jingoism, right? Saber rattling at the smallest of infractions, smallest of instigations. And this is going to make the world an extremely dangerous place. In fact, these imperial wars, the century of ultra-nationalism, that is going to become the cause of both the First and the Second World Wars. ठीक है? Further, with industrialization, another facet of human relationships is going to be opened. The emergence of new economic classes is going to take place. कौन से? The capitalist class and the industrial workers, the labor. Now, Marxists इनको किस नाम से बुलाएंगे? The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Right. And Marx, how is he going to define the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat? As one of class conflict, right? And along with industrialization, the socio-economic and political philosophies of capitalism as well as socialism are going to be born. ठीक है? The conflict between them is going to result in several revolutions and counter-revolutions. Can you name some? The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Chinese Communist Revolution, and in fact, it is also going to become the most dominant feature of the post-Second World War world. क्या emerge होगा इस conflict की वजह से? The Cold War. ठीक है? So, are you satisfied that we have connected almost all the important historical developments over the next 2 centuries with the colonization of India. क्लियर है? एंड इसी तरह के आपको इंटरलिंकेजेस ड्रॉ करने का स्किल डेवलप करना है, राइट? कंक्लूजन, बताओ जी, किस नोट पे कंक्लूड करेंगे? ओके, वेरी गुड. तो इनफैक्ट आप यहां पे ये बोल सकते हैं दैट द इफेक्ट्स ऑफ कॉलोनाइजेशन आर still visible today in the post Cold War world. इंडिया से एक एग्जाम्पल लोगे, किस तरह का? अनबैलेंस्ड रीजनल डेवलपमेंट और अनस्टेबल बॉर्डर्स, दोनों किसने तोहफे दिए हैं? अंग्रेज दे के गए हैं, राइट? एंड वर्ल्ड से एक एग्जाम्पल, क्या? The tangible differences between the global north and the global south, the phenomena of neocolonialism. That although इंडिया में अब ब्रिटिश फ्लैग कहीं पे फ्लाई नहीं होता है, बट ब्रिटिश इन्फ्लुएंस इज स्टिल फेल्ट. इंडिया is still dependent on either the British or the other industrialized countries in some respects. In India's case, this neocolonialism is still mitigated to a large degree due to India's own strengths, but in other smaller newly independent countries, this is a very real phenomenon. ठीक है, तो इस नोट पे आप इसको कंक्लूड कर सकते हो. Now, while discussing the impact of colonization, should we factor in both the positive and negative impacts? Yes, you can factor in both the positive and negative impacts, but you should do that selectively. ये नहीं करना है कि सब कुछ लिखना है. Whatever helps you in constructing a coherent narrative for your answer, only that you should pick and choose. ठीक है? Next, question 7. The British colonization of India was primarily an economic phenomenon. Justify the statement in light of the evolving colonial policy in response to the changing economic needs of the empire. Right? तो यहाँ पे किसके बारे में बात करनी है आपको? नहीं. Yeah. The economic priorities of the British Empire guided its all other important policies, चाहे वो administrative हो, economic policies हो, social policies हो, cultural policies हो, political policies हो, सब कुछ सबके पीछे what is the main mechanism? The economic priorities of the British. In fact, this idea was first expressed by Karl Marx. Yes. when he gave the idea of historical materialism and analyzed the British Empire in India through this lens. He divided British imperialism in India into two phases: the mercantile phase and the industrial phase. Right? Now, later on, an Indian Marxist scholar, 𝗺𝗏 𝗪𝗏, expanded upon Marx's periodization further. He added a new phase, that is the financial phase of British imperialism. Right? Mercantile phase from 1757 to 1813. Industrial phase from 1813 to 1857. And financial phase from 1857 to 1947. Okay? Now, what we need to be aware of, first of all, are the economic priorities of the British Empire during these phases. So, mercantile phase में what was the economic priority? Maximizing profit, maximizing revenue, and minimizing expenditure and losses. Okay? During the industrial phase, what was the main objective? Maximizing the market for British products in India. And during the financial phase, क्या आइडिया था? Converting India into an attractive destination for British investment. Right? So the Industrial Revolution had been going on in Britain for almost 100 years, and the British economy was becoming overheated by the 1850s. Britain had reached the stage of the middle income trap, so that every new pound invested in the British economy would give you diminishing returns in the future. Right? तो अब ब्रिटेन में एक्स्ट्रा पैसा लगाने का कोई फायदा नहीं था. But the British capitalist class had accumulated vast sums of wealth by this point of time. They wanted better returns on their investment. India was under their control. In India, there was supply of cheap labor, raw material was easily available. British industries needed the Indian raw material, and therefore, mineral and transportation में there was a great scope for development. So in fields में British started to invest money, right? So during the financial phase, this was their priority. इतना समझ में आया है? In response to these priorities during the, let us say, first, mercantile phase. What kind of a political policy are the British going to follow? One of aggression or one of non-interference? Non-interference. What kind of a social policy are they going to follow? One of intervention or a hands-off approach? Hands-off approach. क्यों? क्योंकि सोशल सोसाइटी में चेंजेस लाने के लिए, एजुकेशन स्प्रेड करने के लिए, सोशल रिफॉर्म्स लाने के लिए खर्चा बढ़ाना पड़ेगा. They did not want to do that. So, social non-intervention. What kind of economic policy? They wanted to maximize profit and maximize revenue. तो revenue कैसे maximize हो सकता है? By increasing the revenue collection from land, from agriculture, right? And thus, the process of drain of wealth as well as direct plunder would start, right? Efforts would be made to stabilize the revenues. तो नए land settlements introduce किए जाएंगे, such as permanent settlement, such as the ijaradari system, etc. How about the cultural policy? कौन सा cultural policy follow करेंगे? Now the British at this stage are still learning about India. They want to learn more about India so that they can exploit India's resources effectively, so that they can govern the people more efficiently, right? And for that, the dominant cultural ideology was that of Orientalism. Right? In fact, Orientalism became the main factor behind the social non-intervention policy of the British in India. क्या basic belief था इसका? That on the basis of a survey of the ancient Indian Sanskrit texts, the British came to the conclusion that Indians were, first of all, long lost cousins of the British. So there were a number of cultural similarities between the ancient Indian and the ancient British. Secondly, that during the ancient period, the Indians had attained the classical stage of cultural development. However, over a long period of time, because of stagnation and decay, they had lost that shine, they had lost that spark, right? So what we need to do is simply reacquaint the Indians with their lost culture, not to westernize the Indians in any manner. Okay? So this was the effect of the mercantile phase. Second phase में market को expand करना है. Supply over raw material needs to be brought under control. Therefore, is the policy of non-intervention politically going to be continued? No. Now, policy of imperialism is going to be put in place. And large portions of the subcontinent are going to be brought under direct British control. Similarly, socially, is the policy of non-intervention going to continue? No. अब क्या होगा? Cultural hegemony of the British will be sought to be established through a process of westernization. Economically, India has to be developed as a supplier of raw material. Therefore, commercialization of agriculture is going to be brought in. India has to be developed as a consumer of British products. Therefore, deindustrialization of the Indian handicrafts, deurbanization of India, that is going to happen. And culturally, Orientalism is going to be replaced by the philosophy of utilitarianism. And British liberalism, right? Now, among the chief ideas of utilitarians was the thought that both the present as well as past Indian people, ancient Indian people, were barbaric. Okay? So civilization has not existed and never did exist in the context of Indians. And therefore, the role of the British is to civilize the Indians. So that became the ideological justification for their political expansion. We are bringing more Indians under our control so that we can give them a better life, so that we can maximize happiness and make it universal, so that we can introduce modern government, liberal values, liberal politics, etc. ठीक है? ये हो गया the industrial phase. Third wala, financial phase. However, industrial phase had a major reaction. Kya major reaction? The Great Revolt of 1857. This stopped the civilizing mission of the British in its tracks. Or third phase mein, financial phase mein, the British are now going to adopt a much more cautious approach. Instead of extending their direct control, they are going to try and extend their indirect control. Now see, even now, India serves as the largest market for British products. तो India को छोड़कर ये लोग जा नहीं सकते हैं. But in order to shield themselves from political repercussions of misrule, exploitation, they are going to use the Indian princely states, Indian princes, as a buffer between them and the Indian people, the Indian masses. Okay? So they prefer to extend indirect control. The philosophy of westernization, this was judged to be a chief cause behind building Indian resistance, the Great Revolt of 1857. So this philosophy was also abandoned. The process of social reform through progressive legislations by the British officials, that was also stopped, halted. ठीक है? Economic policies में क्या देखने के लिए मिलेगा हमको? That the Indian economy is going to be opened for British investment. In which fields? In railway, road construction, ports, shipping, mining, and plantation agriculture. Right? And especially railway is going to get the biggest chunk of British investment. What was railway construction, or what was the basis of railway construction? Generally क्या होता है? जिसका investment होता है वही risk उठाता है, right? But in the case of India, private British investment was guaranteed at Indian public risk. So Indian taxpayers, the Indian government, became the underwriter of British investments. All British investment was assured of a 5% annual return irrespective of whether the venture was profitable or not. ठीक है, तो इस तरह की बदमाशी करी. And culturally, utilitarianism was replaced by British conservatism. Now, क्या tangible changes देखने के लिए मिलेंगे? Are the British going to continue with their civilizing mission, or are they going to abandon it? As part of their civilizing mission, what were they trying to do during the industrial phase? They were trying to westernize India, ना? तो करेंगे या अब नहीं करेंगे? नहीं करेंगे. They are going to stop it. They abandoned all efforts to westernize India and to bring about social reform. Rather, now they are going to justify their rule simply by claiming racial superiority. So the British Raj is going to become even more racist than it was earlier. Indians are going to be declared unfit for rule. They are going to be systematically excluded from the higher echelons of both public as well as military service. They are not going to be given any tangible share of power. Responsible government is going to be kept at an arm's length distance from them. Indians will have to fight tooth and nail for every little political incremental reform, right? तो बहुत लंबा process लगेगा for modernization of the Indian politics, for the introduction of responsible government. The British are going to justify all of this by saying that Indians are unfit for rule. ठीक है? So it became extremely racist. Second, the British would also try to respond to a new threat that they perceived for the first time. The greatest strength of the Great Revolt of 1857? Unity between different sections of the populations, especially Hindus and Muslims. So the British will try to systematically break that down. They are going to introduce the policy of divide and rule. ठीक है? So this is what you need to write in your answer, but obviously आप सबके बारे में यहाँ पे नहीं लिख पाओगे. ठीक है? So what are the things that you should write about and what are the things that you should exclude? किसके बारे में यहाँ पे लिखना जरूरी है? पहले तो प्रायोरिटीज के बारे में आपको बताना पड़ेगा, राइट? इंट्रोडक्शन में ही आपको ये आइडिया देना पड़ेगा दैट कार्ल मार्क्स एंड आर.सी. दत्त on the basis of economic priorities have periodized British colonialism in India. तो प्रायोरिटीज के बारे में आप बताओगे. फिर उसके बाद you will talk about their political policy, their economic policy, and their social policy. अगर स्पेस मिलता है only then cultural policy, but this is going to be subjective. If you have the time and space, only then include this. तो ओरिएंटलिज्म, यूटिलिटेरियनिज्म, कंजर्वेटिज्म, इसके बारे में आप ओमिट कर सकते हो इंफॉर्मेशन को, बिकॉज मोस्ट ऑफ द मार्क्स आपको इस वाले पोर्शन के लिए मिलेंगे, पॉलिटिकल, इकोनॉमिक एंड सोशल के लिए. ठीक. हाउ अबाउट द कंक्लूजन? हाउ आर यू गोइंग टू कंक्लूड? बताइए. लेटर? अच्छा, तो वो यहाँ पे उतना अप्रोप्रिएट नहीं होगा. वो जो इसके पहले वाला एक क्वेश्चन था ना कि वेदर इट वाज क्रिएटेड इन अ फिट ऑफ एब्सेंट माइंडेडनेस, वो उसके लिए ज्यादा रेलेवेंट है. इसको कैसे आप एंड करोगे? पूरा बॉडी आपको पता लग गया है, इंट्रोडक्शन वी हैव लुक्ड एट. बताइए. But that school of thought has not been challenged by any other historian till now. Once they do that, only then we can do it, na? नहीं, इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में नहीं है, इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में नहीं है. इकोनॉमिक एक्सप्लॉयटेशन दिखा सकते हो, अच्छा, और इम्पैक्ट बता सकते हो. तो यू कैन टॉक अबाउट द impact of colonization, that the three phases of British colonization over almost 2 centuries left India, impoverished, underdeveloped, and bitterly divided. ठीक है? And it was only the guiding spirit of the Indian national movement which has allowed India to emerge out of this darkness since independence. To emerge out of this darkness since independence. ठीक है? India was a special case. So Queen Victoria was the first British monarch who took the title of emperor, and she was the master of several colonies in Asia, Africa, Australia, Canada, कई जगहों पे. But what did she style herself as? Not as Empress of Britain, not as Empress of Canada, not as Empress of China, not as Empress of Australia, but as Empress of India. क्यों? Because India was actually the crown jewel in the of the British Empire. Had it not been for India, Britain could not have had an empire where the sun never set. Okay? So India in this scenario was a special case. Now, coming to the next question. ये वाला हो चुका ना? हाँ. Yes. It was also colonized by the British. ऑस्ट्रेलिया का केस थोड़ा डिफरेंट है इंडिया से. ऑस्ट्रेलिया वाज अ वाइट कॉलोनी, तो अंग्रेज रेसिस्ट तो थे यार. दे ट्रीटेड people who looked like them very differently from people who did not, right? So Australia mein the process of colonization was also very different. See, Australia mein there used to live a large number of aboriginal tribes before the white British people got there. Australia was used initially as a penal colony by the British. So जो unwanted elements of the society होते थे, they were transported to Australia in large numbers. Whether you are a religious minority, whether you belong to a criminal element, whether you are Irish or Scottish, whether you are a troublemaker for the state, whether you have spoken anything against the church or challenged established ideas, तो आपको ऑस्ट्रेलिया भेज देंगे मारने के बजाय, राइट? सो दैट वाज अ solution. As the white population of America started to expand, it started to settle in important locations at the coastal region. Interior जो था वहां पे बहुत ज्यादा अभी भी population नहीं है. It is almost entirely uninhabited. But what happened was that coastal areas से originally the aboriginals were wiped out. They were either pushed back or eliminated. Then ऑस्ट्रेलिया का जो जियोग्राफिक सिग्निफिकेंस है, that became apparent to the British. First of all, it is located very close to India, very close to China, very close to Indonesia. So strategically, it was very important. Secondly, it is a vast source of mineral wealth, right? And it also has a large expanse of agricultural land, right? So usko monopolize करने के लिए the British now started to you can say deliberately settle the land, right? And to civilize it. Civilize का मतलब कि वहां के जो natives हैं उनको खत्म कर दो, right? So they were marginalized even more. And in reality, जो colonization का process होता है ना, which involves the settlement of people belonging to one land in a new land, that took place in Australia. And the government of Australia became an extension of the British government. So almost at the same pace that political reforms were taking place in Britain, they also took place in Australia. India में ऐसा केस नहीं था, because only a small minority of the Indian population was composed of British soldiers and British officials. Therefore, India में process of political reforms was much more halting in nature, much more jittery in nature. तो इंडिया में उस तरह के फ्रीडम्स उन्होंने कभी इंट्रोड्यूस नहीं किए. ठीक है. Now, next question. The 19th century Indian Renaissance was the first step towards modernity. What were the objectives it sought to achieve? बताओ, what is the question about? क्या demands हैं इसके? It is about the 19th century socio-religious reform movements. And specifically, which aspect of these 19th century socio-religious reform movements? The objectives and how it was the first step towards modernity in India. पहले कौन से डिमांड को एड्रेस करना चाहिए? ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, ऑब्जेक्टिव्स और फर्स्ट स्टेप टुवर्ड्स मॉडर्निटी? पहले ऑब्जेक्टिव्स को एड्रेस करना चाहिए. And second, how it heralded the modern age. Why in this way? First of all, it is logical. ठीक है, पहले आप ऑब्जेक्टिव्स बताओगे, फिर उसके बाद उसका इम्पैक्ट बताओगे. And second, this is the note on which you need to conclude. So conclusion को इस वाले नोट से लिंक करना है, right? Now coming to the introduction. बताइए. अर्ली 20th सेंचुरी. अच्छा, तो डेफिनेशन तो आपने ठीक दिया है. दैट एक काम आपको यहां पे करना है, यू नीड टू डिफाइन इंडियन रेनेसां, बट एट द सेम टाइम यू नीड टू कनेक्ट इट टू द मेन बॉडी ऑफ योर आंसर ना. मेन बॉडी में पहली बात आपको किसके बारे में करनी है? अबाउट द ऑब्जेक्टिव्स. तो उसको कैसे कनेक्ट करोगे? दैट दिस ग्रैंड कल्चरल मूवमेंट was guided by lofty objectives. ठीक है, तो डिफाइन किया और एक लाइन लिखा, so that you have a logical connection between the introduction and the main body. And now we talk about these objectives. तो बताइए, why did these socio-religious reform movements emerge? ओके ओके, और बताओ। अच्छा, एनीथिंग एल्स? अच्छा अच्छा, अब इसको शुरू करने के लिए यू नीड टू हैव सम बेसिक इंफॉर्मेशन. वेयर डिड द ड्राइव फॉर ब्रिंगिंग अबाउट सोशो रिलीजियस रिफॉर्म मूवमेंट्स इमर्ज फ्रॉम? क्यों इमर्ज हुआ ये? हाँ, ब्रिटिश पॉलिसी नहीं, ये क्यों इमर्ज हुआ? दिस इंडियन रेनेसा लेड बाय इंडियंस, नॉट बाय द ब्रिटिश. हाँ, यस यस यस. Yes, they wanted to replicate the same pattern of society, economy, and politics in India as well. But more importantly, they were able to perceive the differences between the Indian society and the modern British society. Okay? And they were acutely aware of the defeat of the ancient Indian civilization at the hands of a small British trading company. And they were curious about the reasons that it had happened, right? And this intellectual curiosity about civilizational conflict and defeat led them onto a path of investigation and rediscovery. Okay? They wanted to uncover the secrets of the Indian past so that they could learn the factors for the defeat of the Indian civilization at the hands of the British, so that these could be addressed and a parity may be established once again between the British and the Indian civilizations. So they wanted to address the weaknesses of Indian society and Indian civilization. Okay? So this was the basic starting point. Clear? हाँ. नहीं, not only by the British. His philosophy was a synthesis of Vedantic monoism as well as British liberalism. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि केवल अंग्रेजों से मोटिवेट हो रहे थे. दोनों का सिंथेसिस आपको हर जगह पे देखने के लिए मिल जाता है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, on what grounds did Raja Ram Mohan Roy condemn the practice of sati? Did he give any British legal reasoning for that? नहीं. He did it on the basis of his study of the वेदास, कि वेदास में कहीं पे भी इस प्रैक्टिस को सैंक्शन नहीं मिला हुआ है. सो इट इज पैटेंटली अनजस्ट, पैटेंटली क्रूएल एंड पैटेंटली अनवेदिक, अन हिंदू. ठीक है? सो दोनों से इंस्पिरेशन ले रहे थे. तो इट वुड बी रॉन्ग टू से कि दे वर मोटिवेटेड ओनली बाय द ब्रिटिश. हाँ, तो व्हाट वाज द रिजल्ट ऑफ दिस investigation? Was this intellectual curiosity satisfied? Were they able to learn about what were the weaknesses of the Indian society? Yes, and they tried to address these as well, right? So to strengthen the Indian society and revitalize the Indian civilization, these personalities were convinced of the need for addressing social evils that were prevalent in the 19th century society. Okay? But could these social evils have been addressed without addressing religion of that period? No. Why? Because many of these social evils were part and parcel of the religious practice. They were sanctioned by the religious beliefs. So, addressing these social evils required not simply social reform, but socio-religious reform. Okay? Another objective of these reformers was to rediscover India's lost culture. Why? Because they wanted to challenge the negative British propaganda about Indians never having been civilized. They wanted to challenge the idea that Western civilization was responsible for giving us the highest achievements in art, politics, military, etc. Right? So they wanted to infuse a sense of pride among Indians. Further, they wanted to counter the negative British propaganda against Indians. And thirdly, what did they want to do? They wanted to recreate ancient Indian art forms as universal cultural symbols that all Indians could identify with. So, in essence, they were trying to define the cultural identity of India and Indians as a whole. Okay? So that all Indians could identify with this identity, and all Indians could gather under the same cultural umbrella. So they wanted to create a larger social unity on the basis of cultural uniformity, okay, by reviving these lost ancient art forms. Further, One main weakness of 19th century Indian society was its deeply divided nature. And therefore, through their social reforms, they wanted to unify all Indians. Right? It was a response to condescending colonial policies. Indian Renaissance. Yes, you can say that. अभी इसके पहले जो point discuss किया है, that is what it was about. Right. So these are the grand objectives of the socio-religious reform movements. What is the next thing that we have to talk about? How it represented India's first step towards modernity. कैसे? क्या बोल सकते हैं? Yes. Number one, it challenged age-old practices and prejudices. And you can give some examples, such as sati. What else? Untouchability. The concepts of purity and pollution. The prevalence of superstition or superstitious beliefs and practices, etc. ठीक है? Second, it was India's first tryst with modern ideologies, modern Western ideologies, such as rationalism, humanism, scientific inquiry, liberalism, etc. ठीक है? Third, it was able to heal many fractures in the Indian society, resulting in unity between the different groups at an unprecedented level. Number 4, by reviving the ancient art forms and rediscovering the Indian past, they were able to create a new identity for the Indian civilization based in its past. However, their progressive vision for the future based on modern liberal ideas made the Indian civilization forward looking. ठीक है? Clear? So this is how India took its first step towards modernity as a result of the efforts of these reformers. और conclusion में क्या लिखना है? बताओ. सेम थिंग लिखोगे? हाँ, वो कंक्लूड नहीं किया है हमने. Therefore, the 19th century Indian Renaissance provided the social and cultural basis for Indian nationalism as an inclusive, aspirational and progressive philosophy. ठीक है? So that is the note on which you are going to conclude. Clear है अभी? आया समझ में? Any doubts? Now, coming to the next question. In many ways, the 19th century social reformers were the real founding fathers of the modern Indian nation. Discuss. So this question is very similar to the second portion of the previous question. उसी वाले आइडिया को आपको और expand करके लिखना है. But over here you will have to be more expressive. तो हर point के लिए आपको कुछ examples भी देने पड़ेंगे. For example, you can talk about how Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, their educational missions played a very important role in creating a middle class urban intelligentsia, which then went on to lead the national movement, at least in the initial phase. ठीक है? तो इस तरह से एग्जाम्पल साइड करके पैटर्न वही फॉलो करोगे, बट थोड़े और एग्जाम्पल्स दोगे, एंड देन यू आर गोइंग टू कंक्लूड. आई एम नॉट गोइंग टू डिस्कस दिस पर्टिकुलर आंसर इन डिटेल, ये हम उसको ऑलरेडी डिस्कस कर चुके हैं. नाउ द नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, हाँ ये बढ़िया वाला है. द आइडिया ऑफ अखंड भारत was India's response to European nationalism. अटेम्प्ट किया है ये? बताओ क्या अटेम्प्ट किया है? हाँ, हाँ, अच्छा, अखंड भारत बोला था 1937 में पहली बार. तो देखो, ठीक है, बट ओवर हियर ना you have actually addressed what the question, what is the idea of अखंड भारत, उसका बैकग्राउंड बताया है, उसके फीचर्स आपने एक्सप्लेन करे हुए हैं, उसका सिग्निफिकेंस बताया है. But this question is extremely specific, that the idea of Akhand Bharat was India's response to European nationalism, right? अब कैसे आप लिंक करोगे एक दूसरे से इसको? Yes, exactly. Very good. कि European nationalism received its final shape with the Treaty of Westphalia, the French Revolution, and the Vienna Congress. Right? So this was a long process, almost 200 years long, जिसकी वजह से the basic characteristics of what constitutes a modern nation state in Europe, उसका definition emerge होकर के आया, right? And what was the result of this long dialectical process of revolutions and counter revolutions? क्या क्या मेन चीफ इंग्रेडिएंट्स थे, अभी आपने बताया. पहला, that it has fixed territory with impervious political borders. ठीक है. दूसरा, sovereignty and population under the control of a single authority, one universal government. ठीक है. So presence of a universal government which exercises complete sovereignty over its territory as well as its people. And third, क्या यूरोप में what was the pattern for the emergence of modern nations? Cultural uniformity, linguistic uniformity, right? So the concept of nations as cultural regions with a homogeneous culture and language, with a shared history, with shared values and a shared vision for the future, right? So nations emerge as cultural regions, and the nation state is the political representative of these cultural regions. Clear hai? So this is the basic idea of European nationalism, which emerged between the 17th and 19th centuries. And it was one of these nation states which came into greater contact with the Indian civilization. कौन? The British Indian relationship developed while Britain had emerged as a modern nation state, while Indians did not share this, right? India was still a cultural and geographical expression. Right? Now, with the establishment of the British Empire, resistance against it was endemic. It was natural and it was sustained. Towards the later half of the 19th century, it took on the form of an organized mass movement, and over the next 7 decades, it led the country closer and closer towards independence. Right? And as the national movement matured, the dialogue between Indian and European nationalism became more and more prescient. जो colonial scholars थे, what was their attitude towards India's national movement? क्या है? That it was fictitious, right? So in the context of India, Benedict Anderson जैसे लोग क्या बोलेंगे? Nation is an imagined community. तो हम लोग क्या बोलते हैं? आपका नाम भी तो इमेजिनेशन का ही रिजल्ट है. एवरीथिंग इज इमेजिन्ड ऐसे तो, राइट? तो colonial scholars completely dismissed the idea of India as a nation. And what was that one thing that they always pointed towards while dismissing the idea of India as a nation? One thing that all the modern European nation states had, but the Indian state could not have had. हाँ, कोई यूनिफाइंग फैक्टर नहीं है. कल्चरल होमोजेनिटी जो चाहिए था उनको, दैट इंडिया एज अ यूनिफाइड होमोजेनस कल्चरल रीजन, दैट डिड नॉट एग्जिस्ट. So they denied that India is a unified and homogeneous cultural region. ठीक है? साथ में इन्होंने क्या क्लेम दिया? दैट चलो अगर हम हिंदुस्तानियों को इंडिपेंडेंस दे भी देते हैं, इज इंडिया गोइंग टू सर्वाइव? नो, विद इन 15 years इट इज गोइंग टू डिसइंटीग्रेट. ये उस समय के जो मेजर ब्रिटिश पॉलिटिशियंस थे और पॉलिटिकल थिंकर्स थे या फिर हिस्टोरियंस थे, almost all of them asserted this. However, a counter view was also presented. Kya? That first of all, Indian nationalism is different from European nationalism. While European nationalism is defined by its cultural homogeneity, the basic feature of the Indian experience has been its cultural diversity. But spiritual unity. ठीक है? And it was in this context, as the discussion was now turning towards demand for Pakistan partition of India, that a new concept emerged known as Akhand Bharat. Now, over time, the definition of Akhand Bharat has changed. For example, सावरकर के लिए अखंड भारत क्या था? Was it simply a cultural space or was it a geopolitical entity? हाँ, so it was a geopolitical entity, a full-fledged nation state which would emerge with the merger of the various cultural regions that were historically Indian. But later on, this idea was diluted. क्या बोला गया? That it is not a geopolitical entity, rather it is the idea of Brihad Bharat or Greater India. That is all regions where Indian culture has historically played a very important role. So it would involve every place from Afghanistan right up to Myanmar. ठीक है? तो वो सब कुछ इसमें आ जाएगा. Now, according to this counter view, this Akhand Bharat is not a modern idea. Rather, it is inherent in India's cultural and historical fabric. किस तरह से? कैसे? For example, the Arthashastra talks about the whole of Jambudweep as not only a cultural whole, but also a geopolitical unit. In fact, what is the grand objective of the visionary, ambitious king for which the Arthashastra was written? क्या objective होना चाहिए? To become a Chakravartin by establishing his sole dominion over the whole of Jambudweepa, right? And ये जो चक्रवर्तिन का ideal है, this has been the primary guiding force of all great Indian emperors. Whether it is Ashok, or Samudragupta, or Harshvardhan, or Raj and Rajendra Chola. Right? So the idea of looking at the entire subcontinent as a genuine political and geographic whole, it is not a modern concept. It is embedded in the fabric of Indian history. Rulers and scholars in the past have also perceived the entire subcontinent in this manner. Okay? Secondly, this is also a cultural whole. कैसे दिखता है ये? That this entire zone is a distinct cultural whole. How Indians perceive this land and how foreigners perceive this land, that corresponds to each other. Okay? So for the Greeks, Persians, Arabs, Turks, Mongols, what was India? All the land to the east of the river Indus. Okay? So east of river Indus, for all of them, it was India. And what were the people of this land known as? Indians or Hindu or Hindu. Okay? So this idea was very well developed in the ancient world, that there is a land called as India and there are people known as Indians. ठीक है? एक तो ये आइडिया है. दूसरा, the Arthashastra, the various Dharma Shastras, all of them define the land between the 5 holy rivers and the sea as their holy land. Or Punya Bhumi. Right? So it was not simply their motherland or place of origin, rather it was spiritually connected to them. Right? Thirdly, what is probably the most popular cultural and religious phenomena ever to have taken place in the subcontinent, bhakti. During the ancient and medieval periods, it emerged as a cultural link between different people and regions, right? So they also knitted the different Indian regions, the different Indian languages, the different Indian people together into a common cultural whole. Okay? And this idea is even reflected in the writings of modern scholars before independence who were not affiliated with the right-wing faction. For example, Rabindranath Tagore, while imagining India, thinks of which regions? नेशनल एंथम में कौन कौन से रीजन्स हैं? पंजाब, सिंध, गुजरात, मराठा, द्राविड़, उत्कल, बंगा. Right? Vindhya, Himachal, Yamuna, Ganga, Uchchal, Jaladi, Taranga. Now, he imagines the whole of the subcontinent as India. Right? And therefore, come back to the question. The idea of Akhand Bharat was India's response to European nationalism. Discussed critically. Was it simply a response to European nationalism, or was the idea of Akhand Bharat a very part and parcel of the Indian identity from the very beginning? It was part and parcel of the Indian identity from the very beginning. So that is the note on which you need to conclude. हाँ, लेकिन आपको यहाँ पे एक note of caution भी याद रखना चाहिए that in the conclusion you will have to say, however, it would not be incorrect to state that this idea was popularized as a political idea under the or as a reaction to British denial of Indian nation, the Indian nationhood. ठीक है, तो ये आप बोल सकते हो जरूर. क्लियर? राइट, तो ये तो हो गए the first 10 questions, and with this we have covered certain themes. कौन कौन सी themes cover हो चुकी हैं बताओ? The advent of the British we have covered. The arrival of Europeans we have covered, and early British conquests that we have covered. अगले टॉपिक्स जो हमको कवर, these include British policies. All right. Now, next topic that we need to cover, or next themes, are the British policies while in India, their impact, reactions against them, the anti-colonial uprisings which took place throughout the British rule in India, localized uprisings, so इसमें peasant uprisings, tribal uprisings, uprisings of dispossessed chiefs, politico-religious uprisings, सारी आ जाएंगी. And finally, the Great Revolt of 1857. Right. So, in 3 topics के लिए I have prepared 9 questions, and at least 2 or 3 questions I want you to attempt in the class. बाकी आप अपने घर पे attempt कर सकते हो. कल हम इसको discuss करेंगे detail में. The first question is, the permanent settlement of 1793 had lofty objectives but was bound to fail. Discuss. So I want you to attempt this in class, and इसके बाद इसको discuss करते हैं. Then we'll move on to the other question that I want you to attempt. Right. So please take your seats, and your time starts now. वही 200 वर्ड्स 15 नंबर का। ऑलराइट, तो बताओ, व्हाट आर द बेसिक डिमांड्स ऑफ द क्वेश्चन? ऑब्जेक्टिव्स एंड रीजंस फॉर फेलियर। ठीक है, स्ट्रक्चर का क्या, स्ट्रक्चर कैसा होना चाहिए? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, you need to talk about the objectives, how the permanent settlement was introduced in order to overcome many of the problems associated with the previous revenue settlements, such as the Ijaradari settlement, right? However, it suffered from certain fatal flaws in both its design and implementation, resulting in inevitable failure, leading to immense consequences. इसके बारे में आपको बात करनी है, ठीक है? सो इन द इंट्रोडक्शन, what are you going to talk about? Need of permanent settlement. अच्छा, एनीथिंग एल्स? नीड ऑफ परमानेंट सेटलमेंट एक्चुअली आपको यहां पे एड्रेस करना चाहिए, ठीक है? कि ऑब्जेक्टिव्स क्या थे, व्हाट वाज द नीड दैट इट वाज लुकिंग टू फुलफिल। यहां पे क्या लिखना चाहिए? Yeah, who it was introduced by, when it was introduced, which region was it introduced in, till when did it remain in force. ठीक है? 1793, who were the architects? Cornwallis and John Shore. Which region? Bengal, Banaras and northern Tamil Nadu, representing about 19% of the entire British territory in India at the time of independence. ठीक है? Then you come to the objectives. First of all, to overcome the weaknesses of Warren Hastings' revenue farming method, revenue farming or Ijaradari system. ठीक है? Second, you come to the specific objectives of permanent settlement. क्या है? The stabilization of revenue income, right? और बताओ, how? Okay, okay. अच्छा, so what was the relationship between the state and the cultivator like in this system? Was it a direct one or indirect relationship? indirect relationship. सबसे ऊपर company, the state, followed by the zamindars who were the titular owners of the land, and finally the producers, the cultivator class, who had been reduced to the status of tenants with security of tenure, at least on paper. ठीक है? Therefore, it sought to create a new class of wealthy landlords whose revenue obligation is going to be fixed permanently. That means it is not going to increase with the passage of time. Okay? With a fixed revenue obligation. What is going to be the result of this? Two things. Number one, in order to increase their own income, what are they going to do? They are going to invest heavily in the development of agriculture. Number two, what is the attitude of this class of zamindars going to be towards the British? Favorable or unfavorable? Favorable. They are going to remain loyal and powerful allies. And not two, but three impacts इसके. तीसरा क्या होगा? The improvement of agriculture is going to result in economic prosperity trickling down to the level of the cultivators from the peasants. So it would increase the per capita income of Bengal. And this would also be beneficial for the company. How? To develop a market. So it would deepen the market as well, right? तो ये हो गए इसके objectives. Was it well intentioned or not? Yes. So the objectives were actually lofty. ठीक? However, it suffered from a few fatal flaws which made failure inevitable. किस तरह के fatal flaws? For this kind of a system to actually succeed, it is required that the basic sum of revenue be reasonable. इतना ज़्यादा नहीं होना चाहिए that the system starts to collapse, starts to become counterproductive. However, the initial demand for revenue was excessive. ठीक है? So what was the result? Frequent defaults in revenue payment. तो जो पहला ऑब्जेक्टिव था स्टेबलाइजेशन ऑफ रेवेन्यू, could that be achieved? नहीं हो पाया, at least in the initial stages. Second fatal flaw, the attitude of the British towards the defaulters. किस तरह का attitude था? Lenient or extremely strict? Extremely strict. The sunset clause was introduced in 1794. क्या था ये? that if a zamindar was not able to remit the revenue to the treasury by sunset of the appointed day, his entire zamindari is going to be confiscated and then auctioned off to the highest bidder. What did this lead to? Frequent transfer of land. Was this transfer of land happening freely or through a forced process? Forced process. So is it going to remain uncontested or is it going to be endlessly litigated? Litigation is going to increase. On one side, there would be the zamindar, on the other side would be the company, right? Company के against ही case lodge करेगा. So litigation cost is going to increase. Now, the company had deliberately inserted this class of zamindars in order to reduce its revenue administration cost. We have to collect revenue from a few hundred zamindars rather than from lakhs and lakhs of peasants. So we won't require as many officials. But the savings in revenue administrative costs were offset by the increase in litigation cost. So even एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव एक्सपेंडिचर वाला जो ऑब्जेक्टिव था वो लिखा नहीं है मैंने वहां पर, इवन दैट वाज नॉट फुलफिल्ड. फर्दर, this sunset clause resulted in the auctioning of the land to a new class of big landlords who did not have any experience or interest in cultivation or overseeing agricultural estates. Rather, they lived in cities and outsourced the responsibility of overseeing both agriculture as well as tax collection to their subordinates, agents and sub-agents. So the sunset clause also gave rise to the twin problems of absentee landlordism and sub-infeudation. Right? And इसका result क्या हुआ? The overall burden of taxation is going to increase further. As the levels of tax collectors is going to increase, everyone is going to want a share of the surplus that is being produced. And who is going to bear this entire burden? The peasant, the producer class at the ground level. So it increased the cascading effect of taxation. So the peasantry was greatly impoverished, right? Impoverishment of the peasantry was therefore a major negative impact of this permanent settlement. क्यों हो रहा था? One, because of this reason. ठीक है? Second, because the permanent settlement did not have sufficient safeguards to protect the interests of the peasantry. ठीक है? तो यहाँ पर there was a provision for the giving of patta and kabuliyat to the cultivator. Patta is the title deed and kabuliyat is the memorandum of acceptance. Now, these were supposed to safeguard the tenancy rights of the cultivators. But these documents were issued not by the government, not by the company officials, Rather, it was left up to the zamindars. And why are the zamindars going to give these kinds of protections to their tenants? वो नहीं देते थे, ठीक है? So there were insufficient safeguards for protecting the interests of peasants, right? So this also led to their frequent and summary evictions and increase in vulnerability, increase in helplessness. To prevent being evicted, what would the peasants do? They would borrow money. उस समय कोई banks थे? नहीं थे. Especially banks who would lend money to peasants who were extremely vulnerable. वो banks नहीं exist करते थे. So the impoverished peasantry fell into the debt trap, and rural indebtedness emerged as a major problem. This resulted in further problems such as the complete dispossession of the peasants. Even their lands were taken by the moneylenders, who in most cases were the zamindars only, and they were required to pay off their debt by providing free labor, bonded labor, and this became a generational issue. Okay? So bonded labor also emerged as a major problem. The combined effects of peasant poverty, rural indebtedness, and bonded labor, along with suppressed agricultural yield. Why? Because the absentee landlords were not interested in investing money. They were using their estates as cash cows to squeeze as much of it as possible, as quickly as possible, before they were also forced to auction it off to somebody else, right? So underproduction, all of this is going to lead to frequent famines, right? And these four factors are going to become a major contributing factor towards permanent peasant unrest. So it was in Bengal that the largest number of peasant and politico-religious uprisings took place throughout British rule. So even the gaining of a loyal group of powerful supporters, the absentee landlords, that was offset by this political loss, permanent peasant unrest. Okay? So here we have covered both the fatal flaws and the negative impact of permanent settlement. Conclusion कैसे लिखोगे? समझ में आया ना इतना? आया कि नहीं आया? अब करना है conclude. Conclusion कैसे बनेगा? Go back to the introduction, वहीं पे hint मिल जाएगा. हमने डिस्कस किया ना जियोग्राफिकल एरिया. हाँ, तो इसके बाद after this initial stage of implementation of permanent settlement, is it going to be implemented in other newly conquered areas of the British Empire? No. तो वहां पर new alternatives are going to be introduced, जैसे कि रैयतवारी and महलवारी settlements. ठीक है? Why? Because of these fatal flaws and negative impacts. So that is the note that you are going to conclude on. डन है? राइट, वी आर आउट ऑफ टाइम. हमारे पास एक दूसरा क्वेश्चन डिस्कस करने का इस समय टाइम नहीं है, ना लिखने का टाइम है. सो व्हाट आई एम गोइंग टू डू इज कि जैसे कल ये सारे क्वेश्चंस भेज दिए थे आपको, आज भी मैं आपको भेज देता हूँ. एंड इन टुमारोज क्लास वी विल ट्राई टू मूव एट अ फास्टर पेस. ठीक है, तो कल थोड़ा और तेजी से करने की कोशिश करेंगे. बी रेडी. आप लोगों को टॉपिक्स तो पता है ना कि क्या क्या है? ब्रिटिश पॉलिसीज, एंटी कलोनियल रिवोल्ट्स एंड दी ग्रेट रिवोल्ट ऑफ 1857. इनके ऊपर ये 9 क्वेश्चंस है. वन वी हैव ऑलरेडी डिस्कस्ड. ऑलराइट, ऑनलाइन स्टूडेंट्स, एनी डाउट्स? नहीं? सुमित, क्षितिज, पीयूष, सृजन, तुषार, नो डाउट्स? Are you guys satisfied with the class? You want me to make some changes? All right. Thank you. Thank you, guys.